Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Flying in World of Warcraft. It's had a contentious history, and though it has effectively existed for 90% of the game's lifespan, it cannot be understated how much of a transformative effect it has had on the gameplay. Certainly in the open world, though arguably beyond that as well. But has that transformation been a good thing? Well, most people would give a resounding yes. A significant minority, I imagine, would give a resounding no. Of course, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I have my stance, of course, which you've likely gleaned from comments in my other videos, but I want to be thorough in this analysis. So first, I'm going to give a brief history of flying within WoW, then discuss the pros and cons, as well as my opinion, and then go over the potential avenues to take it in the future. So to start things off, we have the history of flying within WoW. In vanilla, it just straight up did not exist anywhere. There were flight masters, of course, but that's clearly not what any of us are talking about here. The absence of flying led to some very noteworthy design choices, most notably that the majority of the world was built with facades. What may look like an epic mountain range from the ground or a flight path could really just be half of a papier-mâché shell of a mountain. Because, yeah, why bother building the whole thing if nobody's ever going to go there? In fact, it'd actually be slowing the game down for everybody for no reason. Sort of going along with this, we had the inclusion of little scenes that were meant to only be observed while on a flight path, such as the Ironforge airfield, though the more intrepid explorers of vanilla often found ways up there regardless. And while it's by no means the main reason for this design philosophy, I think the lack of flight certainly contributed to the game being more about the journey than the destination. Simply getting to the high-level zones was a memorable experience, or a traumatic one if you were a night elf trying to make your way to Ironforge. The Burning Crusade introduced flying, of course. Specifically, it gave us what is now referred to as steady flight. Basically, just mounts, but able to move in a 3D space. It was somewhat restricted though. For starters, it was only available in Outland, and thus only 7 of the 12 zones. This kind of made sense though, as 4 of those other 5 zones were the starting zones for the Draenei and Blood Elves. The only max level zone that didn't allow flying was the Isle of Quel'Danas. Further impediments included a heavy presence of flying guards over enemy towns, and the awful monstrous Kaleri in Skedis. Furthermore, access to flying was even a bit gated. You had to be level 70, and while regular flying, which gave a 60% speed buff, was fairly attainable at about 1,000 gold, epic flying cost a whopping 5,000 gold. I myself only managed to get it for 2 characters during the expansion. But for alts and people without the gold, you often were flying more slowly than an epic ground mount could move. Of course, you usually save time anyway by virtue of avoiding fights and being able to travel in straight lines, but still. Wrath of the Lich King didn't change much. Flying there could be unlocked at level 77 for 1,000 gold, and was usable throughout all of Northrend except Wintergrasp. We also saw the introduction of the What a Long Strange Trip It's Been holiday meta achievement that awarded both the Violet Proto-Drake mount and Master Riding, which gave 310% flying speed, 30% more than epic flying, and I believe was account-wide. Cataclysm made Master Flying purchasable by individual characters for 5,000 gold, and more importantly, revamped Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor to be flight capable. Flight in these areas required level 60 and cost a mere 250 gold. This meant that almost the entire world could be flown in now, and also the first time you could fly in new zones at the start of the leveling experience. Again, certain zones restricted it, such as Tol Barad. Mists of Pandaria flying required level 90, and cost 2,500 gold per character. And, once again, there were some zones as exceptions, like Isle of Thunder and Timeless Isle. I'm not really going to bother mentioning this part anymore because it always applies. Warlords of Draenor marked probably the biggest point of drama regarding flying. Flying was not available at launch, though was vaguely hinted as coming in a future patch. Blizzard kind of walked back on this and tried to avoid adding flying altogether. There was a ton of outrage from the player base, and eventually Blizz capitulated. I suspect the main reason was simply that Draenor had not been entirely prepared for flying, since it did need to be tested on the PTR. However, it's equally possible that it really was just a philosophical stance that they were taking. At any rate, the end result was the Draenor Pathfinder meta achievement added in patch 6.2. This would unlock account-wide flying for free, but only after a thorough checklist of requirements had been completed. Basically, all of the quests, exploration, completing every Apexis crystal daily, collecting treasures, and getting revered with every Tanaan jungle reputation. The achievement also awarded the Soaring Skyterror mount. Legion continued the trend with the Broken Isles Pathfinder in patch 7.2. It had similar requirements, though was a bit easier overall. Battle for Azeroth did the exact same with its own Pathfinder achievement in 8.2, which also gave the Wonderwing 2.0 mount. Again, the requirements were looser than before. Shadowlands did away with the Pathfinder requirement as it had continued to be a point of contention from the community with every expansion. Although Flight wasn't added until 9.1, it came as part of the patch's main campaign, and thus was the easiest Flight unlock since Mob's Gold purchase. Zereth Mortis in 9.2 had flying restricted at first, with its own meta achievement to unlock it there. Dragonflight was arguably the biggest shakeup to flying since its introduction in TBC, thanks to the implementation of dragon riding, now called skywriting. It was unlocked early in questing, and I believe Blizzard's initial intent was to keep flying in, but at a reduced effectiveness, as initially, its description seemed to be more of a Buzz Lightyear-esque falling with style. To go up, you needed to gain momentum from going down. This would give players freedom without letting them just zip all over willy-nilly. Well, that's not really how it panned out. The capabilities of dragon riding kept expanding until you were basically flying a jet engine. The system was of course more nuanced than steady flight. You had vigor that you primarily gained slowly over time or by gliding at a downward angle, and that vigor served as the fuel for your speed boosts and vertical ascents. That being said, it was not at all difficult to remain perpetually airborne if you were at your keyboard. Turning was slower and you couldn't hover in place, but it was generally considered the superior form of flying, as its max speed was about twice that of steady flight. It was initially restricted to a subset of new mounts and to the Dragon Isles. Patch 10.2 would add Dragon Isles Pathfinder for those who wanted to use steady flight there. Patch 10.2.5 enabled skywriting in all other flight-capable areas of the game, though generally at 85% of the Dragon Isle speed. The War Within expanded skywriting to almost every other flying mount and allowed you to fly after just a few intro quests in Khazalgar. Steady flight was locked behind the fairly easy War Within Pathfinder achievement. Patch 11.07's Siren Isle initially blocked flying, but could be unlocked after about 3 weeks of activities. Although Undermine was built flightless, Koresh allowed flying from the very start. And now in Midnight, we had skywriting enabled immediately for all of the new zones. Steady flight was unlocked through the Midnight Pathfinder achievement, but about 2 weeks into the expansion, it was made available to all. So, to describe that all much more succinctly, flight was added in TBC, treated pretty similarly through MOP, then relegated to the Pathfinder system from WoD through BFA, unlocked via quest in Shadowlands, and massively opened up with Dragonflight and the introduction of skywriting, where it stayed since, and will likely stay for some time into the future. You may be wondering why there was so much drama and have been so many changes and compromises over the years. Well, simply put, flying is a big double-edged sword for gameplay. As much as anyone may enjoy flying, it's undeniable that access to it fundamentally changes open-world gameplay. I believe some devs back in the day even went so far as to admit that adding flying was the biggest mistake they'd made, because once you open that bottle, it's impossible to put the genie back in. So, what exactly are these drawbacks that flying introduces? Well, I think I've boiled it down to 3 major concerns. The first is that it undoubtedly trivializes a great deal of content. The classic criticism is that now you can just fly over all of the guards instead of having to fight your way through to your objective. Now, Blizz can always circumvent it by sticking quests inside caves or large buildings, at least to a point. I think it'd be disingenuous to imply that flight has led to a complete disappearance of open world difficulty, but it's certainly not to the same degree as, say, in vanilla. This may or may not be something you care about. Maybe you think open world difficulty is stupid, but it does provide satisfaction and immersion to at least a portion of the player base. On a tangential note that I consider more of a side grade is that travel time is cut down significantly, which means we're usually given more activities to maintain a certain level of engagement. The second drawback is not one that is of major concern to me, but has certainly been a massive concern for others, and that is the impact flight has had on world PvP. Take everything I said about trivializing difficulty in open world content and multiply it by 7 here. In a flight-filled world, all you need is 1.5 seconds to mount up, and you can fairly easily avoid any number of scuffles. It's not always possible, and inclusions like the Net-O-Matic give ways to force players off their flying mounts, but it's again a far cry from the vanilla model that encouraged far more player interaction. Even I, someone who usually shies far, far away from world PvP, had a ton of fun in BFA's faction incursions in war mode, and I think a crucial element of that formula was that it happened before flight was added to Zandalar and Kultiris. I can see the counter-argument though, that being stuck in such a situation for an extended period of time because you can't get away on a ground mount or get a hearth off may have been an unpleasant experience that you're happy to be rid of. The third drawback, and the one that I consider by far the most significant, is that flying reduces our familiarity and attachment to the open world. Look, I appreciate the beautiful sweeping vistas that flying enables, but I can't deny that any zone where I had to hoof it winds up far more ingrained into my brain than those where I could fly around from the start. I could draw you a pretty detailed map of Frostfire Ridge, a decade-old zone, but only give you a broad strokes one of Onaran Plains, a 4-year-old one, because you simply don't have the opportunity nor the need to learn their topography and general layout if you're gliding over top them. You would have to deliberately choose to ground yourself to have any hope of it, and the more you're down on the soil, surrounded in all directions by the environment rather than blitzing over top the environment, the more of an emotional connection you're going to develop. Part of it is literally being in the thick of it, and some of it is the navigational demands placed on you when you have to find your way to a road or up a hill. Of course, there are just as many pros to flying. I think these are more obvious and don't need to be spelled out in great detail, though that probably reveals my own biases, so for that I apologize. But a quick list would be that it does enable seeing the world from more diverse and beautiful angles, that it adds a lot of convenience and efficiency that many players are big fans of, and it's just plain fun for people, especially the more dynamic skywriting. I think these are all extremely valid viewpoints. But in case you haven't figured it out yet, I sort of stand somewhere in the middle. Well, maybe a bit towards the no flight crowd. I still want zones to be designed with flight eventually being accessible in mind, but it's become obvious to me over the years that I tend to have more fun in the world when I'm charting my course on the ground instead of catapulting into the sky every few minutes or even seconds. The early days of outdoor content in WoD through Shadowlands were just massively more fun to me than Dragonflight through Midnight have been, and I really do believe a massive component of that was the lack of flight. And an extremely unpopular opinion, I'm sure, is that I actually don't really like skywriting all that much. I still use it, of course, it's fast and thus useful, but flying in parabolas is draining my spirit, especially when used to zip around a questing area. I'm sorry, I just don't find the addition of a minigame to actually enhance flying for me in any way whatsoever. So yeah, flight kind of spoils the fun for me a little bit. In fact, though I didn't do it on my first playthrough of Midnight, I did dedicate one playthrough spread across 4 alts to doing the leveling quests without flying, and I did have more fun doing it that way. And for the Last Titan, I'm considering doing it on my first playthrough. Look, I don't hate flight by any means. I don't want it removed or neglected, but I do think it's often a huge detriment to fun and engaging gameplay. So then, with all of that out on the table, where do we go from here? Some players find the game more enjoyable with flying and others without. How do we resolve this in a way that makes as many people as happy as possible? Well, the sentiment I most often hear from the pro-flight crowd is that nobody is forcing you to fly. You can stick to ground mounts. Stop trying to restrict other players. And while I get that they don't want to be impeded by other players' arguably selfish desires, I don't think this is actually a sound argument for several reasons. This is an MMORPG. You're playing with other players, and flight is an advantage. Even if the experience is more pleasurable, most of us would struggle greatly putting ourselves at such a massive disadvantage. Time is money after all. And heck, when it comes to professions and gold making, you are very directly gimping your own potential by riding your goat around instead of your dragon. None of us play this game in a vacuum. Other players flying does affect you. Obviously, you can still play grounded, but you have to accept the price that you're paying to do so. But even if you do, you're still not getting as nice of an experience as you could because the world itself and our objectives within it have been designed with the assumption that you can fly. Sometimes this means the scale of the zones, such as the absolutely massive Azure span. Sometimes it's literally impasses in the quest flow. During my grounded midnight questing, I hit several of these. Not many, mind you, but 3 side quests were basically impossible without flying, and so was the Zulaman quest where you travel to Eccles Zone Shrine. Okay, So if just don't fly isn't a satisfying answer, what is there? Well, we've got options. We could go back to requiring max level to ensure at least one grounded playthrough, but given how that takes a day or two, it's a pretty trivial gain for the pro-grounded crowd. We could also go back to Pathfinder. I myself loved the WoD version and was actually disappointed that each successive version got more and more lenient. But there was a lot of animosity toward Pathfinder from the pro-flying crowd, so it's probably best just to avoid that altogether. Besides, the spirit of those achievements seems to have been somewhat inherited by the new expansion meta achievements. One potential answer that I've recently seen floated and wholeheartedly endorse is the potential addition of a flightless mode, some sort of toggle that you could enable that would literally disable flight for you while it's applied. By making it an official mechanic and not some self-imposed restriction, Bliss could do extra things with it. I think extra XP and rewards, similar to War Mode, would be entirely justified given the additional time and hurdles you'd be facing. Though I have seen pushback on that for whatever reason. I think people just don't want to feel compelled to go flightless, and if that's the reason, my response is simply a sarcastic, just don't turn it on then. But alternative to that compensation, I suppose cosmetic rewards would work as well. An achievement, obviously, but maybe a title, mount, or transmog or something. While I would appreciate the reward, I fear that anything one time would just lead to us all turning it off as soon as we complete it. I'm not entirely sure what the best solution here is, but I do feel like a separate mode is the best path to finding a solution that everyone can be content with. And Blizzard seems to be paying attention to the pro-grounded crowd's sentiments. Kaivax made a post when they globally enabled steady flight for Midnight that included the following. In the future, we will continue to look at how the ability to fly affects our play experiences. Since the release of Midnight, we've seen some great discussion about how Midnight hits different from a ground mount, and we agree. It's fun experiencing quests at a less frenetic pace than that which is enabled through flight, and it's rewarding to engage with the world from the ground level. While we don't have any plans to restrict flight access meaningfully in the future, we'll keep these discussions in mind as we continue building WoW. As always, keep the thoughts and ideas coming. Your feedback truly does shape what the game becomes in the future. We, of course, don't know what this will ultimately lead to, but I'm hopeful. I don't think those that hold flight as precious need to worry about it being taken away from them ever again, save for a patch zone or something, but I think those who enjoy a more terrestrial experience may have more satisfying options available to them in the future. Oh, and I also want to give a shout out to Ferora SF's video, Dragon No Flight, a love letter to ground travel, and her follow-up videos, where she documents her attempts to level a character through Dragonflight and beyond without flying, while also looking at the history of zone design in regards to ground and air travel. She goes into far more depth and gives far more examples than I did, though I made sure to write this script before watching her video to hopefully rip off her video as little as possible. For this week's drawing, the most obvious fit to me seemed like Herdrin Wildhammer, or Falstad, but if I'm being honest, I don't care about either of them in the slightest. Or there's Toddy, who was introduced in Dragonflight, but anytime I hear her speak, I want to gouge out my eardrums. So guess what, we went with the bronze aspect, Nosdormu the Timeless One. I mean, it kind of works. The Dragonflight expansion as a whole has very strong ties to flying, and Nosdormu is pretty much the narrator for the Legacy shorts, and the aspect who shows up to help at the end of the Drakthir starting experience. So that's good enough for me. Though if I'm going to be totally honest, Nosdormu is probably the most boring aspect, at least out of the Cataclysm generation, which is really weird if you think about it. This guy has seen the moment of his own death, and has to grapple with the supposed inevitability of him turning into Murozond. That should have made for a very interesting dive into his beliefs and worldviews. But Dragonflight kind of handled it way too cleanly. Like, he and Eternus of the Infinite Dragonflight basically just talked things out. And we're like, yeah, not everything should be changed. But also, sometimes it's okay to try to change things. It felt like a very underwhelming resolution. But I suppose them working together does sort of tie into Dragonflight's family theme. So I do have to give it credit for that. Also, why did they have so many of the aspects use elves or half-elves for their visage forms? I think instead of Chromie, Nosdormu should have had a gnome visage, but keep the same deep, contemplative voice. I think that would have been amusing. And yeah, I stuck them in Dawn of the Infinite, since I already used Caverns of Time when I drew ETC, and this is the other Bronze Dragonflight area. Anyway, I think I've spent enough time on this video. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.